Scholars of the Apostle Paul have long debated the so-called center of Pauline theology, focusing on themes like justification of faith, reconciliation, union with Christ, and the more recent, the apocalyptic triumph of God. But what if love really just is the center of the gospel that Paul preached? That's what we're talking about today. This is the Attach You to God podcast produced by Embodied Faith. And we have joining us again, Nijay Gupta. He is the Julius R. Manti Professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary. He co-hosts the Slow Theology podcast and has written numerous books, some of them being Tell Her Story, as well as we had you on to talk about Strange Religion just a couple months ago. And today we're talking about your new book, The Affections of Christ Jesus, Love at the Heart of Paul's Theology. Thanks so much for being on with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Excited to dig in.
Well, I know when I saw this book flash across probably my Facebook feed, as you mentioned it, like a cover release or something like that, I was like, oh, we have to have you on, especially the Attaching to God podcast, to talk about love and the New Testament, but especially Paul's theology. And this book is not disappointed. I'm so excited. The copy is in the mail. It's going to show up Monday.
Nice.
Or sooner. I don't know. And yeah, I was telling you before we got on, I'm telling all the listeners, this is going to be like a cornerstone kind of piece of research that I think as I and we and Sid and others kind of keep talking about attaching to God, that this kind of understanding is just going to be so helpful. So thank you so much for taking the time to write this book.
Yeah, I love it.
Now, because we are all people, we're embodied. We, embodied faith, but, we're embodied.
Right.
You got recently, you tell us where you live and what kind of storm you just got hit by. Because us in the Midwest,
Yeah.
and if we have any listeners in Minnesota, they're going to have no kind of sympathy. But tell us what happened to you just last week.
Well, it rains a lot here. I live in Portland, Oregon, and we get a lot of drizzle. And we had cooler temperatures in the low 30s. And so we actually had some snow. We had our first kind of serious snowfall. And they actually canceled my kids' school Thursday and Friday. And then Monday was a holiday. So I had a lot of time with my kids. And the funny thing here is even if it's just an inch, the whole city of Portland will shut down. And everybody will work from home, and the kids are at home, and we won't drive them to friends' house. So we had a snowpocalypse. It actually wasn't that much precipitation, but it does. I will say in my own defense, I'm from, I've lived in Boston. I've lived in northern New York. I grew up in Cleveland area. I will say what we have here is, number one, it's very hilly. So you have to deal with that, whereas Ohio is pretty flat. And number two,
the hills make a difference.
When it's running in that low 30s, it's going to turn to ice, and it's going to go back and forth. It's going to melt and turn to ice, and so you got kind of black ice sort of situation. But yeah, nowadays we expect a few snow days for the kids.
Oh yeah. For those who are not raised and familiar with snowy regions, it's that like the 10-degree snowstorm is bad, but it's not so bad. It's the 34 that then drops to 32 or drops to 29, which turns all the rain into ice, that's the really
dangerous
snowstorm. Well, we're here in Western Michigan, so we have little sympathy for you. I also have friends at our doctoral program who are from Texas, and they get that 1/4 inch of snow, and then they're racing out for water and Pop-Tarts because the world has ended. All right, well, enough of that. So you've written this book on the affections of, let me get the title right here, The Affections of Christ Jesus, and then how love is at the heart of Paul. But you also, and when we were talking about this beforehand a couple months ago, you're like, I use a lot of emotion theory to kind of get at this. And I was like, even better.
Yeah.
So as this podcast bridges the neuroscience and the spiritual formation, could you talk a little bit about how you got into that?
Yeah.
Even as like a research question, why do we need brain science to help us do some Bible study?
Yeah.
And what did that kind of churn up for you?
Yeah. I come at the subject from a number of angles. One of them is just I write Bible commentaries. And so, you tend to hone in on kind of the more serious stuff in the New Testament or in the Bible. And the way I was trained, the way most New Testament scholars are trained, is you kind of skip past the fluffy stuff in Paul's letters, all of the hi, how are yous. all of the greet so-and-so, and you're my beloved, and all of that. And you just get into the meaty stuff in Romans 2 through 4, or 5 through 8, or, the doctrinal stuff in 1 Corinthians 15. And, I think instinctually many of the, especially Protestant, Western types of scholarship, we have kind of a instinct to screen out relational things, emotional things, and just zero in on cold, hard doctrinal facts. So as I'm writing commentaries, I'm coming across all this love language in Ephesians or in Galatians or in Romans or 1 Corinthians. And what I naturally do is I start looking up scholarship who's talking about this. I was shocked to find how little biblical scholarship there actually is, New Testament scholarship, Pauline scholarship, on the language of love. And when I was pitching this book to Erdman's, my publisher, I said, no one's written a book like this in over 100 years. To me, that's just
Wow.
crazy. It's
Really?
absolutely insane that this would be in every letter of Paul, at the beginning of every letter, usually towards the end, and in key sections, Galatians 2, Romans 5 through 8. I mean, it's pretty much everywhere. I mean, Ephesians itself could be called a homily on Paul. Let's go to the other end of the equation, which is my own personal experience. About 6-7 years ago, I went to the ER with what I thought was a heart attack. I would have been in my early 40s at that point. But I was talking to a doctor friend. I said, my heart's beating on my chest. I'm feeling faint. And he said, to be on the safe side, go to the ER, get checked out. I got checked out, wasn't having a heart attack. There were no clear physiological reasons. And they said that their diagnosis is I was having a severe anxiety attack. So they connected me with a biofeedback therapist, and she basically said, you're not taking care of your emotional well-being. And at that time, I was reading Jamie Smith's work on You Are What You Love and some of the stuff that he's done on kind of bringing Augustine back into the theological conversation. And his work on the problem of thinking about ourselves as brains on a stick. I was living out that reality in not really thinking and taking care of my body, not taking care of my mind, not thinking about my emotional well-being, and just saying, hey, I'm a good brainiac. I'm just going to brainiac out this problem, whether it's theology or my health. I wasn't an integrated person. I wasn't living as an integrated person. I wasn't thinking of the Christian as an integrated person. And that really got me, I started to pay more attention to emotional language in the Bible. And then I was writing a Philippians commentary, and I noticed how much Paul talks about joy and how strange it is to command someone to experience joy. I mean, we would think that it was insensitive if you were sitting in the hospital with somebody going through a cancer diagnosis or going through terminal illness, and you just say, hey, be happy. Like it would come across as insensitive, mean-spirited, irrelevant. And yet that's what the Old Testament does. That's what the New Testament does. Be joyful, love, do not fear. And I'm actually giving some lectures on this on Saturday, coming up in a few days. And I'm going to actually quote one of my favorite TV sketches, comedy sketches from Mad TV. This is 1997. And there was a Bob Newhart sketch where he played a therapist offering to do 5-minute therapy sessions. There was a woman there who had claustrophobia.
This is my wife's favorite
I love
sketch.
it.
She
I love
always, we always talk. We do it back and forth. Okay, sorry for all the listeners who don't know where this is going, but my wife and I will do this back and forth with each other just to be like silly.
My wife's a therapist, so yeah, we laugh about this. So Bob Newhart playing this 5-minute therapist and very serious, and this woman comes in. I'm having all these nightmares about being trapped in a box. All the stuff. I can't be, in any contained space. He's taking notes. He says, okay, I got 2 words for you. This is my therapy. I got 2 words. She's like, okay. And she's confused, but she's writing it down. He just says, stop it. And she's like, excuse me? And he's like, stop it. And then he even spells it for her, S-T-O-P-I-T. It's hilarious. Listeners, look up Stop It, the Stop It Mad TV sketch, and you'll find it. And I feel that way sometimes when I'm reading the Bible and it says rejoice.
Uh-huh.
as if you could just, you're having a bad day, Jeff, and I just say to you, stop it. Stop it. Rejoice. And so that got me down really trying to understand our emotions, because I think too many of us, either we fall into two ditches. One ditch is we ignore the emotional world altogether and we just power through it, or we comfort eat through it, or we just ignore it. United Methodist Church did a study, this is about 20 years ago, of just how unhealthy their ministers are. They noticed that there's aging population, United Methodist ministers. They're in their, many ministers are in their 60s, 70s, 80s. And it was actually costing a lot of health insurance money to take care of these aging UMC ministers. And so there's a huge study, and it was just completely obvious how much pastors, and especially people in the caring industries, give, and they don't really take care of themselves, whether physically, emotionally, mental wellness, all that stuff. And so as I dug into emotion theory, I just kind of stumbled upon something called the appraisal theory, or you call it the appraisal theory. I have no idea what it's called, but the appraisal theory, which goes back.
Either way,
Yeah.
right? Because you could say Augustine, you could say Augustine.
Yeah,
Like, don't let anyone
Augustine,
say that there's only one way to say it. Appraisal,
Yeah.
Oregon,
Oregon. Oh, we hate that.
Oregon. I'm in the Midwest, so I get it all the time, but I'm
Yeah.
like, that's wrong. It's wrong. Okay. I'm from California, if all the listeners forget. Okay,
Yeah.
continue.
Yeah. So this developed in the 1950s, 40s and 50s, with a theorist named Magda Arnold. And prior to that time, the dominant theory about emotions, called the basic emotion theory, was emotions are just kind of knee-jerk responses to stimuli. And so, we're watching this TV show right now called The Gorge, which is awesome. It's kind of like a thriller romance. It's amazing. But
We just finished it.
You just finished it? Okay,
finished
we're about halfway through. And it's got a lot of jump scares. Like my son and I, my son and I, my wife watch it, and we're like gripping the seat because we know something's coming. So when you have a jump scare, like, you shudder. It is knee-jerk. And so for many, many years, people just treated emotions as, okay, I got a text with a free coupon for truffle fries, at Burgerville. Oh, that's going to make me happy because suddenly I got this, this news and I'm happy. But then, I didn't get that promotion at work and now I'm sad. And this idea that emotions are just these things that sort of happen to us. And psychologists, emotion theorists, they say, yeah, that does happen because, certain things trigger us and we have these emotions. But Magda Arnold, she noticed that you could have one event, one situational event, and two people in that event have opposite emotions. So the example I give in the book is I grew up in Ohio where we have lots of thunderstorms. And I experienced them frequently growing up. And I love thunderstorms. I love to just sit and watch. I pull up a chair. My mom, at my mom's house, we have these huge windows and just sit and watch. And I love it. It makes your heart beat fast because it's this, really electric, awesome phenomenon. But I'm not scared. I'm not scared I'm going to die. Whereas my kids grew up in Oregon. And so when we visit grandma and grandpa and there's a thunderstorm, they're like genuinely scared. So same event, different responses to that event. And what these appraisal theorists would say is, and this is kind of language I use, we have micro emotions. And micro emotions are like, I got that coupon for fries. I'm feeling really good. That's a micro emotion, and we'll experience those, and we can't really change or edit those much. They just sort of happen. But we have what I call macro emotions, which is kind of how we feel like we're doing in our life, this kind of barometer. And there's a theorist named Richard Lazarus. He calls it subjective well-being. So we have this radar or this barometer for kind of how we're doing in life. Are we reaching our goals? How would you rate your overall happiness, your overall sense of contentment? And when it comes to that, we have our radar up for our situation. And we will screen or analyze our situation instinctually and decide instinctually whether the situation is congruent with our goals and that will increase our subjective well-being, or incongruent and it'll decrease our subjective well-being. So for example, you're at a work meeting, there's a group of people in the room, you're in a little conference room, and the boss says, hey, I got good news. One of you is getting a promotion. So 2 or 3 of you're like, okay, could be me. And they announce who gets the promotion. And it's Jeff and not Nijay. So same event, but your radar's up and you find this congruent with your overall goals. So your subjective well-being goes way up. And I'm like, oh man, I deserve that. Jeff comes in late. Jeff leaves early. Jeff eats 2 donuts on payday. Jeff steals Staples.
From California.
Yeah.
Unreliable.
Yeah, he wears Birkenstocks too much, like all that stuff. And so then it's incongruent, so my subjective well-being goes way down. And
like a third option would be the person who was not even thinking they were in the running for the promotion. And if they got the promotion, then their excitement level would skyrocket,
just way up,
right?
way up. Yeah.
Yeah, because it was unexpected.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they'll be elated. They'll have joy. And so so what I think is so important about this is how much our peace and contentment in life tracks with our appraisal of our situation. I mean, God forbid if one of us got a diagnosis of a major illness, that's going to bring things obviously way down. But then you have people in your life that care for you, maybe someone that's gone through cancer or gone through an illness, that will come to you and they'll say, hey, Nijay, I know this sounds terrible, but, you can identify with people going through difficult things in a really unique way now. And now you're starting to reappraise the situation saying, I can have a ministry in this, or they'll say, you don't want to say God has a plan. You definitely don't want that to be the first thing you say. Or you're going to be an angel or whatever, some of these weird things that people say. But there is a place at some point with a certain kind of relationship to say, God's got you in this, and what you're doing is your situation's not changing, but you're reappraising the situation.
Yeah.
And so this changes how we look at language like joy and love, because this goes back to the moral philosophers of the ancient world, but even the way we think about it today. When we tell someone be joyful, we're not saying manufacture fake joy. What we're really saying is reappraise your situation in order to see how God actually has your subjective well-being in mind. Or when we say love, we're not saying manufacture feelings of love. We guard these people we love, and what God is saying is open up your life to include other people you may not even expect, like strangers and enemies, into this circle that you guard, that you feel like secures your subjective well-being. And so the love language, it actually has to do with the deepest level of our commitments, who we allow in our circle, and what we think is success, what we think is well-being, what we think is thriving. Okay, now go.
All right. Well, just a summary, because what we'll do is now dive into the kind of the love stuff in Paul and Jesus.
Yeah.
And then I want to circle back to those kind of conversations. So in one sense, and to kind of add some other pieces, I came across the appraisal theory through Dan Siegel and the interpersonal neurobiology kind of approach. And then I went on a deep dive through all this stuff a couple of years ago. And so someone who is a giant in the field, Joseph Ledoux, he was like a fear researcher, and he made a big switch in the middle of his career just to follow the point that you made there, and he said, we should stop talking about emotions like as this huge category. What we need to do is talk about survival circuits, which are kind of those semi-automatic reactions of fear, of anger, of sadness that are very like causally related to circumstances. Like if your child's stepping out into traffic, you're just like, bam, and you grab them in your heart. Like it's just a survival response. He says we need to differentiate that as fear. And he's like, we should stop calling that fear. But like the brooding fear or like a real kind of long-term like thing. So he uses the micro macro, that's very similar. So I just love that. And it does help us get to an understanding of the commands of joy and and the commands against like anxiety that Paul gives,
Yeah,
like in
do not
Ephesians and
worry.
things like
Yeah,
that.
Philippians 4, yeah.
Right. Which and the trouble is on one side of the church that doesn't take emotion seriously, they're like, yeah, see, stop worrying and you need to have joy. It's all cognitive. It's all willpower, right? So, well, that's not right. And then there's another side that's like, you should never tell someone to be joyful and you should never tell someone not to be anxious. That's a
Right.
chemical imbalance and they can't help it, right? And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there needs to be like some way behind it. I feel like this appraisal theory is really important. But let's really quick shift then to love.
Yeah.
You do a brilliant job talking about like love in the Old Testament, love in the Greek kind of language. But sorry, we're just gonna skip all that. Let's talk about love in Jesus,
Yeah.
and how the uniqueness of like the dual love command. So could you kind of just fill that out, and
Sure.
then we'll kind of jump into
Yeah,
Paul.
I mean, we can't talk about Jesus's commands without talking about Deuteronomy. So really briefly, it's interesting.
All right,
Yeah,
fine,
we
we'll
have
talk Old
to. We
Testament.
have to. It's interesting if you sat down with, your typical Western Protestant and you say, "What's the Old Testament about?" They might
God smiting random
thoughtlessly
people.
say it's about the law,
Yeah.
or it's about works, or it's about fill in the blank. And what I say in the book, and what I say to my students often is, if you actually sit down with a rabbi today, or if you sit down with a Jewish person like Paul or Jesus back in the first century, they would actually open up to probably either the book of Exodus and read, "The Lord is gracious and merciful, abounding in steadfast love," and so forth, or they would read from Deuteronomy 6, "The Lord God, the Lord is one, you shall love the Lord your God," and all of that. And so the heart of Jewish religion, the heart of the covenant, is not a bunch of weird laws. It's actually love. I mean, we know what Jews prayed in the first century. They prayed the Shema, which is Deuteronomy 6, love the Lord your God. They prayed the Psalms as well, which is why Jesus, Paul, and the apostles were so familiar with the Psalms and quoted them so much. And so this is going to be on Jesus' mind. And love is one of those things, like people say, is very hard to define, but you know it when you see it. I was having a conversation with someone recently, and he said, "Nijay, I'm not a touchy-feely person. I'm not like mushy, emotional person. So does that mean I'm left out of these love commands because I just don't have the same kind of let's have a bro hug, feel it out sort of thing?" And what I said to him and what I learned from emotion theory is everybody loves. Everybody loves. It's just we express it differently. Every single person loves because following these theories and following Augustine, we could talk about Augustine later. Well, let me just mention this from Augustine because it'll help us understand Jesus. I think it'll help us understand Christianity. He says, this is Augustine, he says, when we ask whether someone is a good man, we're not asking what he believes or hopes, but what he loves. That quote all by itself unlocked the Bible to me in a way that I just never understood before. What that means is we are designed, I was going to use the word attach. You're the attachment guy.
Let's do it.
We were designed to wrap our souls around things and people. So using emotion theory and Augustine, I like to say, imagine your soul has tentacles. And it's in our nature to wrap our tentacles around ideas, things, events, memories, people. So naturally, that's going to be your family. Naturally, that's going to be your friends. It might be your vocation, whatever it is. We wrap ourselves around these things. And so, and that's going to affect our ideas. That's going to affect our habits, our virtues. So, what's interesting is if you're a pastor, you could preach great sermons. But if you haven't gotten to what people have wrapped their tentacles around, you're not actually going to change the lives and behaviors of the people in your congregation. You could have your doctrine perfectly right in your sermon. But if you haven't addressed what those tentacles are wrapped around, then you're not actually going to affect change, certainly not lasting change in your church. And that was kind of the missing piece for me. So when the Shema says, love the Lord your God, it's not like bring God a box of chocolates. It's not like trying to push out tears when you're in front of, at worship. It's really saying, what have I wrapped my soul around? We use the word heart. I was actually trying to think, Jeff, how is it that we in the Western world actually came to use the word heart as the seat of emotion? Because we know biologically it has really nothing to do with it. I think it's probably because our heart races and we feel it when we're experiencing fear or deep love or whatever.
You don't think it has anything to do with the Psalms or something like that?
Well, what's funny is I was talking to somebody about this
Created me a clean
yesterday,
heart.
is the Hebrew and Greek language of heart are almost interchangeable with mind, which then tracks more with science, neuroscience, that our mind is actually creating a lot of these things rather than that. But you know this. I have a stomach illness, and I've come to learn that your stomach is called your second brain, your parasympathetic and parasympathetic systems. And so the stomach actually qualifies better as your seat of emotions than your heart, just biologically.
Well, I was kind of, to jump in, I was kind of being facetious though. Like partly it is the scripture language. I think it is that phenomenological experience. And now, so you mentioned the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So the vagus nerve, which kind of connects all that together. So polyvagal theory, it basically will say things like the nerves that are connected to your face, especially your eyes, are also connected to the nerves that regulate your heart rate and your breathing rate. And your eyes and your face is how you communicate with people. And so there is that sense in which, like, my heart was racing when you fall in love with someone, or my heart fell when I got bad news, or I saw someone's face, and I knew that someone was dead, right? And there is like this sense in which that vagus nerve is regulating your heart rate. And they do all sorts of studies about how quickly your heart rate, like, so there's a whole thing, but basically this is where I always feel like, well, ancient people they were phenomenologists. They were like observing the body. They didn't get it all right as far as like how it all fits together, right? But that those experiences, they were like pretty right on. And then now, this is why I'm so into the neuroscience, is like it's showing a lot of the stuff to be true. So yes, our heart is the seat of emotions because it's also the interpersonal center.
That's right.
Through the vagus nerve.
Yeah, that's right.
That was a big long aside.
But even in Greek, in the ancient Greek, the seat of emotion, the Jewish concept of it, which came into the Greek-speaking world, was actually the bowels, the stomach, or the intestine. So when Jesus has compassion over Israel, over Jerusalem, it says literally he shook his bowels. And actually the title of my book, The Affections of Christ Jesus, comes from Philippians chapter 1, where Paul says to the Philippians, he's in prison, he says, I long for you with the affections or the bowels of Christ Jesus. Okay, we want to get back to Jesus. Why is Jesus commanding love of God and love of neighbor? I'm going to get a little preachy here, Jeff.
Let's do it.
So I give a sermon sometimes on this called The Parable of the Safe and the Sprinkler. So imagine that your soul, your whole self is a big house, is a big metaphorical house. And at the center of that house, there's a safe, a small safe that can only hold one thing, which is the thing that is most precious to you. So you think about those tentacles. So it's that thing where the biggest, most powerful tentacles are going to be wrapped around that. And for Christians, for the people of God, we're expected to protect Father, Son, and Spirit, God, in that safe. So I had someone ask me the other day, why does Jesus say, whoever doesn't hate his mother and father is not worthy of me? Why would we hate our mother and father when the Ten Commandments says we're supposed to honor and love our mother and father? Well, that's because when Jesus is saying hate them, he's saying never, ever put them anywhere near that safe. Because our temptation is to put our friends, our job, our wealth, our status, our looks, our hopes and dreams into that safe. It can only be God. But also imagine in this theoretical, metaphorical house, there's a sprinkler system, and it's very powerful. And it shoots out water not only to water your lawn, but also, some of it waters other people's lawns naturally as it shoots outward. And so one of my students also brought up, why does Jesus say love the world? He loved the world, John chapter 3, but then 1 John says don't love the world. Which one is it?
Right.
Am I supposed to love the world or am I supposed to not love the world? Well, we have to understand context. Love God uh, and don't love the world means God goes in the safe, but loving the world is for the sprinkler system. So we're called to protect a smaller safe and to build a bigger sprinkler. So when Jesus says the two great commandments are love God, love neighbor, this is where I go back to Augustine. It's really about Augustine's theory of ordered love.
Mm-hmm.
Too many theologians said, okay, emotions get in the way of good theology. They get in the way of the good Christian life because we shouldn't act out of emotion. We should act in cold, neutral ways. There's an important theoretical book, I think from the 80s, called More Than Cool Reason, which is talking about how we use metaphors. And the old idea, this is George Lakoff, the old idea was scientifically, we should always speak in very objective, neutral ways. Don't use metaphors. Metaphors are fluffy garbage. And so cut out the metaphors, the icing, and get down to the good stuff. Get down to the nutritious stuff. And this is really popular in the early Enlightenment era. And then, so if we're looking at the Bible that way, let's get rid of all the metaphors, all the emotions, all the mushy stuff. And Lakoff argued that metaphors,
so like most of the Old
most of the
Testament,
Bible,
much of the New
yeah,
Testament.
most of the Bible.
This is seriously
cut it
though.
out.
This is why certain churches will just preach Paul's letters because they're like, well, that's the.
But even in Paul's letters, they're going to get rid of the majority of it because it's so much emotion stuff. And so he wrote a book called More Than Cool Reason to say the metaphors aren't there. The metaphors aren't there just as fluff. Actually, we think in metaphors. We live in metaphors.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the same applies to emotions. It's not fluff. It's not a distraction. Augustine would say, desire is not the enemy. Desire is actually the goal. It's actually the origin, the means, and the goal. It's just we have to order them correctly. If we are oriented towards God correctly, by loving God first and foremost, like the safe illustration, then we're going to output our emotions and output love in the ways we are always meant to. It's kind of like a kink in a sprinkler line. It's not going to output correctly unless that flow is there. And so when Jesus says, love the Lord your God, he's not saying give God a big hug. Definitely emote to God, but it starts with understanding what we're wrapping our lives around, what we're putting in that safe, and orienting our lives towards God. And then that will help us correctly orient our lives towards neighbors, strangers, and enemies.
Yeah. So I'd like to put this in attachment language because I love Jamie Smith's book, the shorter one, You Are What You Love.
Yeah.
But the more of this like attachment and the neuroscience, I was like, and I love Augustine, right? So I did part of my dissertation on Augustine too.
Yeah.
Thank you for being a biblical scholar that positively appraises Augustine.
Yeah.
Not all do. But the more I've been reading this stuff, the more I'm like, I'm not quite sure You Are What You Love actually captures it. I think it's like more of what you said about the tentacles. It's you are what you're attached to, or you become what you're attached to.
Yeah.
And then even deeper, it's kind of like you are who you're watching, right?
Yeah.
So little children learn how to appraise, or they learn proper or appropriate emotions. How? By watching how their attachment figures respond to a situation.
Yeah.
Right. And so if the first time they encounter a mobile, fluffy creature, say at a friend's house, they're not either immediately afraid or joyful. What do? They look at their parent to find out, is this a dangerous creature or is it a safe creature? And if the face of the attachment figure is calm or inviting or joyful, then now their emotions of that child is shaped to such to be like, I can be curious, I can discover this world, I can continue in discovery mode. But if for whatever reason your attachment figure hates cats, if you haven't figured out that's what we're talking about, then the child will internalize that fear or that disgust and will move away, right? So our emotions are, and you talk about that in the early part, that this appraisal is kind of, it's a combination of past experiences, but also cultural influences about what is good or bad, or what is acceptable, or what is
success,
scary, or what is not scary,
Yeah.
right? And that primarily comes through your attachment figure, right? And so our emotions should be attached to God so that then we can love the world.
Yeah.
And I think that's the whole point. The more that only God is in that safe, the bigger your sprinkler system is probably going to end up being.
Yeah, and
All right.
to defend Augustine a little bit, I think that is what Augustine is saying.
Yes,
So let
for
me give
sure.
an example. So his famous saying is, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in God." That's kind of where you're going with this in terms of attachment. Your language of attachment, I think, is similar to his language of rest. So let me just talk really quickly
Yeah.
through his illustration that he gives. So he gives three important Latin words. So whoever's listening, you're getting some Latin today. He
Yes.
uses gravitas, which is weight, weight or gravity. He uses requies, which is rest, and then he uses caritas, which is love. And he says every object or substance has a natural weight to it, meaning if I pick up a rock and I drop it, Augustine doesn't know the theory of gravity, so he just thinks the rock wants to go to a resting place, so it will push and push and push until it gets there. But then why does fire go up? He didn't understand why does a rock go down but fire goes up, and he doesn't understand why it goes up. But his thinking is it also has a resting place, but its resting place is in the opposite direction. And he says humans have a resting place, a requies, and they have gravitas to move towards that. And the resting place is caritas, which is love. And I think that is exactly what you're saying about attachment is his notion of rest, I think, aligns with what you're saying about
Yeah.
attachment. Yeah.
Well, let's go to Paul then. What do you want to focus on? I'll throw it out to you. There's so many things that I have like multiple questions, but kind of
Yeah.
what do you feel like you'd want, people who maybe regularly read Paul's letters or feel like that,
Yeah. Well, I mean,
it's
I think what do I really want out of this book is kind of the opposite of a disappointment that I find in a lot of big books on the Apostle Paul. So you think about James D.G. Dunn, N.T. Wright, Douglas Moo, all these big names, and they write these massive 1,000-page books on Paul. And what they do is they talk through kind of an ordo salutis, an order of salvation, calling, justification, glorification, regeneration, all this stuff. And there's no place for love. And what you end up doing is you say, oh, I should talk about love. And they end up tucking it away in a little tiny section in the back of the book that nobody ever gets to called ethics. And to me, that is, you put that there and you've got the whole thing wrong. You got it all completely wrong. You've missed the whole thing. It actually belongs at the very beginning. When people talk about justification, like you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, justification or apocalyptic triumph of God, these atonement questions, they're actually means questions. They don't get to the origin, and they don't actually get to the point to me. They're interesting in terms of understanding mechanics, but actually the point is love. So the gospel originates out of God's love. Now, this shapes how we view God. Paul talks about, I'm crucified with Christ, Galatians 2:20. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I live by faith, I live in the flesh by the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. The origin of the gospel is the love of God, empowered by the love of the Spirit and demonstrated in the love of Christ. And one of my favorite scholars, Michael Gorman, he has a quote that I quote in this book. Paul was nothing if not overwhelmed by the love of God. The origin of the gospel is love. The means of the gospel is love. The response of the gospel, it's supposed to be our love towards God, rightly ordered, like Augustine said. Rightly ordered and redeemed. And then that's meant to turn us towards fellow believers in love. But then people stop there. And I'm convinced the absolute hardest teaching in the Bible is when Jesus says, love your enemies. And Paul talks about this in various ways as well. Jeff, ultimately what I want people to think about as they read my book is, what is the goal of the Christian life? And prior to writing this book, I might use the language of maturity. I might use the language of, being filled up, in the Spirit or walking in the Spirit. I mean, there's all kinds of tricks we can use from the Bible, but now I think, gosh, we've missed it. I've missed it if it's not all about love. Now, it's not ushy-gushy love. Famously, Richard Hayes, New Testament scholar, now blessed memory, he wrote a book called Moral Vision, the New Testament in the 1990s. And he actually argued in that book that love is not the center of the moral vision because he says, quote, it's a cover for all manner of vapid self-indulgence. And he says it's much debased in popular discourse. I think that he threw out the baby with the bathwater. He said, let's get rid of this ushy-gushy love stuff. And it's about the cross. It's about eschatology. It's about new creation. And what I argue is all of those things are means, and they're all great. But the origin, the setting, the purpose is love. And if we don't get that, if we don't focus on that, we've missed it. I'm going to give you one more thing. You can come back at me. Philippians 2, 4, and 5, 2, 3, and 4. Paul says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself. Verse 4, look not at your own interest, but the interests of others. His verb here in Greek, skapeo, it's a verb of looking, but it's really a verb of fixation. What are you fixated on? What are you obsessing over? What is your attention on? And he says our sinful inclination, our carnal, our fleshly inclination is to say, I'm worried about my stuff only. Now, of course, you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself, which implies you love yourself, which implies you take care of yourself. He's not, in wisdom teaching, you often give extremes and you're not saying everything you want to say. But what he's saying is, Jeff, Nijay, other people out there, our sinful human tendency is to obsess over loving ourselves in a protective, excluding way. But he says, actually, the gospel should transform us in such a way that we are freed up to fixate first on God. But then he says, but to others as well, and not say not my problem, but say my problem. Your problem is my problem because I'm a Christian. Your problem is my problem because God made my problems his problems.
Yeah. Well, just to kind of sum up some of those things I heard with the things that I've been really interested in is like that the purity of heart, which if we want to go back to, Psalms as well as the Beatitudes, but then also training for love. This is why I've been really interested in the kind of monks and ascetics, because their goal for asceticism or ascesis is training. For them, it was training for love.
Yeah.
And sometimes they get a bad rap for being anti-body and things, but like their goal was to train themselves so that they could fully receive the God who is love and then fully offer that to a world.
Yeah.
And then the shorthand of that would be something like purity of heart. Is like, I got to purify my affections, my emotions, I have to put the right things in the safe, and for me, that's just like this attachment language. Could you answer just one last thing? Because I think this is really important. And when I read the question in one of the sections, I was like, oh, that's important. Because you said, why people will ask, why does it seem like Paul's talking a lot about faith and less about love? And yet you're arguing that the center is love.
Yeah.
And Jesus acts that way too. Is like, he talks a lot about faith and repentance and things like that, and a little bit about love. And the love certainly seems central. But how does faith and love then fit together?
Sure.
I think that'd be a great way to finish up.
Yeah. This is an interesting kind of academic curiosity because if all Jews...
Oh, no, this is very practical.
And practical. But if all Jews prayed the Shema every day, they're talking about love all the time. And we know that from the rabbis. We know that from lots of Jewish texts from the ancient world. So why is Paul talking so much about faith and not as much about loving God? He does in a couple of places, but it's not the thing that's always on his lips. And I think that he just formulated a really sophisticated understanding of pistis, which we often translate as faith, but I think maybe we mistranslate it, and maybe and I have a book called Paul, Language of Faith, so I put a lot of thought into this, but I think it might be better translated like loyalty, or some people say allegiance, but allegiance can sound very militaristic, and I think he doesn't always mean it in that way. I think he means it in a, faithful and true kind of friend sort of way. But actually, I've been thinking about this after I wrote the book, and I hate that when you come up with new ideas after you wrote the book. But Jews and early Christians latched on to the Greek word agape, which was previously underutilized. It was kind of collecting dust on a shelf before Jews used it in the 2nd century BC for the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Old Testament. And then in the Greek-speaking world, Jews picked it up and used it as one of their what I call mascot words. They're going rah, rah, rah for this word. But to a wider audience of Gentiles, it might not be as familiar. So actually, my latest thoughts, Jeff, on this, I've never said this out loud before. My latest thoughts
All
on
right.
this is that for Paul to be preaching to Gentiles agape with a term that is a mascot term for Jews but would be broadly unfamiliar to Gentiles, he's still going to use the word. He loves the word agape. But it's going to make more sense to Gentiles if he uses the word loyalty or allegiance, which was a more common word for a social virtue of faithfulness, devotion. Love and faith would overlap. Think Venn diagrams. They would overlap in meaning devotion. So I think he changed up his terminology. A little tip for preachers out there. Change up your language. So I think Paul did that too. I mean, think about when he first met Christ on that road to Damascus. He gets blinded by this light. Why are you persecuting me? He doesn't know the Lord Jesus the way that Peter did when Peter calls him as one human to another, an incarnate human to another. He doesn't call him and say, "Come follow me." He blinds Saul and says, "Go sit blind for 3 days and figure out what you did wrong. You're in timeout for 3 days." So he knows him not as didaskalos, teacher, but he knows him as kurios, Lord. I think that has something to do with it. He's trying, I think, to tether these words, faith and love, together.
Yeah. No, that's good. And I love that desire for like kind of new language. I think there is a sense in which, the language of love, and especially for those who are Christians, like, yeah, I know God loves me. But for us, even this podcast called Attaching to God is kind of just that way of like using a different term, certainly with a truckload of science, to get at, well, what is love really doing beyond kind of a sentimental emotion? And I think attachment gets at that. I think the word agape, certainly faith and fidelity, hesed in the Old Testament, covenant love, covenant faithfulness, enduring love that you see in the Old Testament. All these are kind of, all kind of in the mix. Well, thank you so much for spending some time here. Where can people find you? And, what else are you kind of working on these days?
Thanks. I have a Substack called Engaging Scripture, and that's a newsletter read a couple times a week, and you'll get some fun stuff about the Bible, biblical studies, some of my work that I'll put out there ahead of time. I have a podcast.
It's a great resource. I'll just kind of plug it because sometimes it'll be book reviews. Sometimes it'll be your own
all
thoughts
sorts of
and
fun
insights.
stuff.
Sometimes it'll just, it's great.
Yeah, a lot of resource stuff. And then I have a podcast called the Slow Theology Podcast with AJ Swoboda. AJ's a theologian, Pentecostal theologian at Bushnell University. I'm the Bible guy, and we just come together and we talk through the hard stuff of Christianity. We don't skimp on the hard stuff, and then we just say, okay, let's try to walk slowly together towards Jesus in the mess of real life. And so we want to be champions for the gospel. We want to be good news people in an often bad news world, but we don't want it to be, what I call folk apologetics, where we just sort of give people an easy Band-Aid for their bleeding wounds. We want it to be real serious and thoughtful stuff. And then what I'm working on is, I don't think I've announced this officially yet, so you'll be the first one.
Oh, we're getting all the good
You're getting
stuff.
the first
I like
one.
Let's break some news.
AJ and I wrote a book called Slow Theology, 8 Practices for Resilience in a Turbulent World. And we just got the release date. It's actually coming out this September. September 2025. We thought it'd come out in 2026, but
nice.
but the publisher was able to get it out early. So I'm super excited. We try to put together the best piece of advice we've given, or tools and resources for helping people find stability in Christ in a turbulent world. And I'm just really excited about that, because especially pastors, Christian leaders, just need whatever resources and practices they can get for helping their flock, their people navigate a very tumultuous world.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and to continue breaking news, you just told me right before we jumped on, I invited Nijay to speak at our this year's summit, the second Attaching to God summit. So he's going to be there, and that's also in September. Or no, it's in October, October 14th through 16th, but I'm really excited. So thank you for doing that. So you listeners, you'll be getting more of this great scholarship as we move forward. Well, thanks again for being with us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. We could talk for hours, but I'm glad we got the time we
I
did.
think we could. I think we could. Maybe just like every 6 months, I'll just
Yeah.
have you on. We'll just like once I get my hard copy, my paperback, I'll thump through a little bit more, and I'm sure we'll get some more questions on there. Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure.